Good morning where you are, I believe, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you. Greetings from very snowy Sweden. So, transforming universities for the future. One of the things that I found over 20 years of thinking about the relationship between education and the future is that quite often we don't really have a fixed idea of what we think the future is when we have these conversations. So I'd like to invite us all just for a minute to close our eyes and just have a think. Imagine yourselves in 2050. What sorts of world do you see? What are you basing your assumptions and your ideas about the future on? Whenever we think about, you can open your eyes again now, whenever we think about education in the future, I think it's very helpful to, if you like, locate ourselves in that future. Think about how old we're likely to be at that point, or how old the students that we're working with now, how old the children, our children, might be at that point. So the future is a real place. What sorts of futures are being made at the moment, and what's the role of the university in relation to this? Well, some of the futures that we hear talk of a lot and that we need to engage with fairly urgently are futures around climate change and the risk that we face of tipping into uncontrollable runaway climate change, given the tipping points and tipping cascades that we may be reaching. We also have futures of technological transformation. So we have Elon Musk sending cars into space. We have the significant and very interesting developments in genomics and biosciences. But we're also living in a world of geopolitical conflict and in a world of significant social unrest, as well as an aging world. So there are a lot of trends and developments that are at play at the moment that are going on in the world, and that raise some questions for us as universities in terms of how we should respond. And what should the role be of the university in making the future, in making futures in these sorts of interesting times? Now, one response to this question is to say it's not really the role of the university to try to make futures. It's not the role of the university to engage in all of this. Our job is to retreat, to do the things that we've always been doing that will, in the long run, prove to be useful. There are some problems with that response, I think. Firstly, we are funded and supported by public institutions and public organizations and the public in general, who will be asking, well, what is it that you are for, dear universities, if you're not engaging with these questions? At the same time, I think if we look at the history of the relationship between social change and universities, is we have seen that in these sorts of conditions, other educational institutions set themselves up, other research institutions, whether this is the coffee houses of the 17th century, whether it's the Royal Academies of the 18th century and the Royal Societies, whether it's the very significant popular educational movements or decolonial educational movements of the 20th century. And what we're starting to see today is a whole range of alternative educational institutions beginning to establish themselves. This is not to mention the very significant research infrastructure that does exist outside universities already. But the educational institutions such as, for example, the Ecoversities Network, who are beginning to demonstrate what an educational agenda might look like that is embedded in place and in relations of care with the world. So I think our strategy, a response of retreat really, is one that has a number of questions associated with it. And it suggests really that if we don't respond to the world, then others will. Now, the kind of opposite response is a sort of a bit more gung-ho. It's a bit more, we can do this. So this is the response that says, yes, bring us your global challenges, world. We will fix this. We are the saviors. We can solve all of these problems, particularly with our science and technology. Now, there are also some problems with this sort of response. We need to recognize the fact that in the last 50 years, we have seen a huge and significant impact of humans and our science and technology on the planet, what Will Stephan and others call the Great Acceleration. And just as we've seen the increase in negative impacts on our ecosystem, so too have we seen a massive increase in universities over the same period. This is not to say that the increase in universities causes this, but it is enough to ask us the question, how is it that as we have become more and more educated over this period, our negative impact on the planet has increased? As David Orr has asked, he said, is it the case that we have become more educated but not more wise? So perhaps rather than, if you like, running away or assuming that we can fix it, it's time to ask a slightly different question, time to take a different sort of approach. And if we're going to take that approach, I think it's helpful for us to think about how we as universities have responded to change before. And when I'm talking about we here, I am talking mainly about the European research university tradition that has informed development all around the world, but I need to recognize that university histories are obviously much deeper, more complex than the one that I'm about to present here. But this particular development of a university has been so influential that it's worth us bearing it in mind when we think about a question about how we rethink universities for the future today. So I'm thinking in particular about the emergence of the Enlightenment University. So that period in the 17th and 18th centuries, early 19th centuries, when the emergence of a radical proliferation of knowledge and information was starting to raise real questions about the way that universities of that time were organized. And in that maelstrom of new knowledge, new discoveries, new information, emerged the idea of the disciplinary research university, led obviously by the Humboldt brothers in Berlin. And this university emerges, as Chad Wellman argues, as a particular sort of institution to solve a particular sort of knowledge problem. These universities, this university structure, Wellman argues, was designed to organize the institutions, materials, practices, and people of knowledge into a relationship, to order into a coherent whole whose end was science. The research university and its ethos of specialized science were a solution to a particular problem in the history of knowledge. Now, this particular solution brought with it some implications that we are still living with and that have an impact, I think, in terms of how we think we might start transforming the future today. So one of the key implications of the epistemological shift with the Enlightenment University was that the idea of the authority of knowledge, that epistemic authority and accountability should be with the discipline, with the academic body itself, rather than with the state or the church. Now, the way in which that survives, the way in which it maintains its authority, the way in which it, if you like, gains legitimacy for that particular argument, is only if it argues that other potentially competing sorts of knowledge are not valuable. So with the rise of the Enlightenment University, we also have the exclusion of knowledge of Africa, of the East, of the Americas, of women, of everyday practice as, in Kant's terms, unreasonable and manifestly inferior. So when we look at the way in which the research university responded to the particular knowledge problem of the time, what we see is a gain in terms of technical knowledge through specialization, but a massive loss of knowledge that is embedded in people and place. And when this university knowledge principle is then allied with colonial and nation building projects, we also see it underpinning what de Sousa Santos calls epistemicide, so the killing of other sorts of knowledge. So what do we take from this very short reflection on a particular critical point in the history of universities? We get the awareness that universities have changed before, that those changes have been substantial in terms of the sorts of knowledge that is valued, but that some of the Enlightenment responses to change in the past, the ones that we are living with today, may be causing us problems in responding to change today. And here I tend to think about a kind of military analogy. If we think about generals, quite often the story is that they are always fighting the last war. And I wonder sometimes whether our universities are, if you like, fighting and addressing the last knowledge problem rather than the one we're facing today. So the question then might be, well, what is the knowledge problem that we are trying to solve today? And I'd like to suggest that this sustainable goals framework is as good as any other in really framing the challenge of knowledge that we're facing at the present time. And that is an awareness of the very complex and interdependent and messy relationships there are between all the sorts of challenges that are needed to create a better future. And surely, if nothing else, the aim of the university should be to create better futures than the ones that we're living with at the moment. Now, the problem with the way that universities tend to respond to these SDGs is that they filter them through the disciplinary structure and through the idea of the university, if you like, as separate from the world, with a number of negative consequences. So, for example, we see university vice-chancellors will all be saying, clearly quality education is very important and that's what we do. At the same time, we see the other goals getting dropped into disciplines and faculties. So you might see difficulties with life below water or life on land. Okay, the biosciences are dealing with that. Issues of clean water and sanitation, energy, infrastructure. Okay, the engineers are on the case. Good health and well-being. Well, obviously the medics and our medical faculties are working on that. All the complicated stuff around economics and around sustainable cities, yeah, don't worry, the social sciences have got that covered. So what you get is this fragmentation of the SDGs into different disciplines. We also get a number of SDGs that are not really thought about by universities because they're seen as, if you like, outcomes. So the outcomes, the challenges that we're aiming for to eradicate poverty, to produce zero hunger, to achieve climate action, all of these tend to get seen as, if you like, activism or impact work or applied activities that aren't at the core of what the university does, which is increasingly negatively thought about as positioning itself in a global market for international students and research funding. So this is clearly not a particularly intelligent way for us to respond to the contemporary knowledge problem that we're dealing with. And it might help to take a step back to help us think about, well, what does sustainable development mean? And the definition, the Brundtland definition, is one with all of its problems that we might want to work with. In other words, sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that is an overarching question to ask ourselves in terms of our university practices. Seems a potentially interesting place to start. At the same time, what that does is it says you can't pick off each of these goals individually. You have to think about the interrelationships between them, the interdependencies between them. We know that, for example, you will not be able to achieve fantastic sustainable cities and communities, decent work and economic growth, if your ecosystem is destroyed and if there is no clean water and sanitation. And there's a real risk that we're heading in that direction. At the same time, we know that we aren't going to make the climate changes that we need unless we have a more equal environment where we are able to ensure that people are not driven to destroy their environment by economic hardship. So these things are interrelated. There is no way that either poverty or climate action, for example, should be thought about separately. This becomes very visible when we think that 50% of the global consumption emissions are produced by 10% of the global population, and that 10% includes us in universities. So thinking through climate action and poverty together is, if you like, one of the ways in which we need to understand that sustainable development is a complex and interrelated knowledge problem. So if that's the case, then the question we might want to ask ourselves is, what would it look like if we in universities took seriously the complexity and dynamism of the world when we think about creating sustainable futures? How do we think beyond business as usual towards thinking about how do we develop a wise university. Now, what I've been focusing on in the last year or so is thinking about, well, how might that manifest itself at the level of the university? And I want to make a few proposals. Here, this analysis is drawn on what Sahai Inyatullah calls causal-led analysis. And I want to suggest that we have the opportunity as universities to act on 4 key levels. Firstly, at the material level, we as institutions can become leaders in terms of taking responsibility for the SDGs. We need to think of ourselves as material institutions. Secondly, at the structural level, we as universities have a huge opportunity to contribute to the rethinking of economics and to the generation of sustainable public dialogue about how we create sustainable and fair societies. And if that's our agenda, we need to think about the role of the university as a public institution. At the third level, we have this knowledge problem, this question of how do we learn to live with complexity and uncertainty, with the fact that the world doesn't cut itself up into easy disciplinary sized pieces. And finally, at what we might call the mythic level, we've got the fundamental question, how can we cultivate wisdom? How can we nurture wise relationships between people and planet? Now, if we look across the world, we can see that the seeds of a wise university are beginning to emerge in a range of different sites and practices. We can see at a material level that there are many universities experimenting with the idea of a living campus, with rewilding the land that they're responsible for, with developing strategies for food that are very low emissions. Importantly, we're seeing universities understanding the need to divest from fossil fuel investments. At the structural level, we're starting to see in places like Preston and Cleveland the development of universities that take real responsibility for their economic impact in the local community. So the approach, the Commonwealth approach in Cleveland and Preston is a fantastic example of how universities can really see themselves as public and as economic institutions. And there are many examples. The Talua network from around the world, for example, gives some real senses of how universities are beginning to think of themselves seriously as acting in public. At the epistemological level, at this question of knowledge, we're starting to see the development of really serious interdisciplinary programs that think carefully about how we stitch different sorts of knowledge together. And here, we're not simply talking about developing a set of modules and allowing students to pick from anything that they fancy. We're talking about really sustained efforts to build an understanding of the contributions that different disciplinary perspectives can bring. And one of the things that we're doing in Uppsala at the moment is playing with what I'm calling a faculty for symbiosis. In other words, a faculty and a research and an educational space that allows academics and students to come together to think about how they generate something new, something unforeseen, something that they might not be able to predict together. And the reason that we have a picture of a Portuguese man of war up here is because this particular creature is not one creature, it is a combination of different organisms that together create something new. And that's why we work with this as a metaphor for what we're talking about. And finally, at the mythic level, we're beginning to see a range of different approaches to thinking about how we enable students to find their place in the world. The mental health crisis that is confronting young people all around the world for a whole variety of reasons, from economic precarity to rampant consumerism to ecological anxiety, is really beginning to place a pressure on universities to take their pastoral role much more seriously, not see this simply as, if you like, what you have to do when you're trying to educate students, but to understand that one of the things that we're trying to do in a university is to develop wisdom and to develop young people who are able to be wise. So there are a whole range of different approaches emerging in the world where people are beginning to experiment with this question of how to develop a wise university. There are universities that are really beginning to understand that the knowledge problems that we're facing now are not the same as those that we faced in the 18th century and led to the structures with which we've been living for a long time. It is time now, I think, to reinvent the university if we want to create better and more sustainable futures. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to talking with you all shortly.